So under what circumstances do you think that same-sex gatherings, let's say, should be permitted or required? Because this is actually a very tricky issue, right? Because my wife and I have talked about this a lot, and she's actually a little harsher on this front than me. And she thinks that women invaded men's spaces so badly that this is part of the backlash. But underneath that, there's a real complexity, right? Because I might say, well, is it okay for rich men in London to have a men's-only private club? Because that's a good question, right? That's a border issue here, and it begs a more sophisticated question, bearing on what you described, which is, all right, when is it necessary for the sexes to have their own spaces? And what are your thoughts about that? Like, where should we draw the line? Because part of this argument, culture war, is about where we draw the eternal line. Bathrooms seem, at least until recently, as an unquestionable bastion of same-sex privacy. But we've obviously blown way past that and made it almost mandatory for that to disappear. Change rooms as well.
Yeah.
So where do we draw the line as far as you're concerned? I mean, when should the sexes have their own space?
So freedom of association is an important right. And if people want single-sex spaces, like if somebody wants to set up a man-only book group or a woman-only book group, I don't think they should have to explain themselves. I can see the issue with, dining clubs and so on, where a lot of politics happens and where a lot of power play happens and so on. If you keep women out of those spaces, or you were to keep Black people out of those spaces, you would be hoarding power. And I genuinely think that's a difficult question in law, because it's hard to say of one space, that's where the backroom brokering happens, and of another space, well, that's harmless. That's just people who have interests in common. And then when it comes to spaces like toilets, I mean, it's amazing how fast people forget things. But when women started to do factory work during the Industrial Revolution, there were no single-sex toilets. So women had to use the same facilities that men did, which were not exactly sanitary or nice or private. And those became spaces where women experienced a lot of violence, a lot of sexual violence. So women, factory girls, would go to the toilet in groups and protect each other and watch each other, or indeed go out on the street and just rely on the fact that they had big skirts.
Oh, so that's why women go to the toilet in groups. Of course, that's why. Because that's why. Because it's
in decent ones, but in decent separate toilets, no, you just go to gossip. But yeah, women would not drink water during the day, so they didn't have to go to the toilet. So there was actually a decades-long fight to get women's toilets and women's facilities. And in most countries, labour laws will still say that you must have women's toilets in workplaces where there are women. And then in sport, it's obvious why you separate the sexes, but actually you can separate the sexes a little bit differently in sport. You can do it as female only and open. Because if a woman is, unusually large or strong or something, and she can compete maybe at the lower ranks of the men's divisions, why shouldn't she? It's not a problem for anyone. So you protect one category. It's the same as, a 17-year-old.
It's a problem for men. I remember when I was a kid, so there was this girl who fell into the category that you just described. She was a pretty husky, tough farm girl, and she was genuinely tough. Like there were definitely boys that were afraid of her. And I would say that was all boys, and there was a reason for that. The first was, well, she was actually pretty tough, and so if you were playing shinny hockey on the street and she gave you a check, you pretty much noticed. But there was an additional complication, which was, if she took you out, well, then you were pretty damn pathetic because you'd been flattened by a girl. But if you fought back, you were even more pathetic because then you fought back with a girl. And so, you might promote the open category, but that puts men in a terrible conundrum because there's a real rule for good men. There's a real rule. And the real rule is do not pick on women. Like, that's number one rule of good men, right? And under any circumstances whatsoever, at the cost of your reputation. And
so in anything that's got physical violence involved in it of any sort, and I'd include rugby, say, or American football in that, you can't have the sexes compete because it's not just about strength. It's about things like the way the neck is made, the thickness of the skull. Women are really not evolved to protect themselves against punches the same way that men are. But in sport more generally, so I actually come from a very sporty family. I have a bunch of very good cricketers as brothers and sisters. And my sisters would play on the boys' team when they were little because there weren't girls' teams. So the girls had to jump from 11 to 15, and there was no under 13s. And I mean, when they were 11, they were teeny tiny. They couldn't be playing with the 15-year-olds. So they went on to the boys under 13s. And the thing is, the boys then did complain. This is a good long time ago. They complained because my sisters were so good. And indeed, the girls were taken off. But I mean, this is cricket. There's no genuine complaint there. It's just not wanting to lose. So I think, you know, you can conceptualize it in like 90-something% of the cases that the female category is like the under 18 category. A 17-year-old is allowed to compete as an adult. A 19-year-old is not allowed to compete as an under 18.
Right. Yeah, well, it seems like a tentative solution, at least. On the freedom of association front, so what if I said something, you know, rather radical, like, well, let the bigoted half-wits hang out with whoever the hell they want. And so if people want to set up a man's-only corporation, for example, well, have at her. I mean, you've just cut yourself off from 50% of the talent pool, which probably isn't the wisest move in the world. And maybe even if you want to do that with prejudice in mind on the racial front, you should be allowed to do that too, in the hopes that such behavior would be immediately revealed as self-defeating and eradicate itself from the public commons. Because the alternative, that's the freedom of association argument in some sense, right? You get to hang around with whoever you want. And the ultimate expression of that, by the way, is sexual congress, right? Because the most discriminating form of behavior that any of us ever indulge in is on the sexual front, where we discriminate madly on every grounds you can possibly imagine, constantly and in principle to our own advantage, with no care whatsoever for the disadvantaged and oppressed, right? And we regard that as a cardinal right. I don't have to sleep with anyone I don't want to or don't want to. It isn't even need. You know, in Huxley's Brave New World, that went by the wayside, and it was a sign of immorality to say no to anyone who offered a sexual invitation.
Oh, well, we're heading that direction. I mean, there's even a book called The Right to Sex. I mean, there are arguments now about how, say, an ugly or a fat or a disabled or an elderly or a poor man, you know, he's not going to get anyone to sleep with without paying. So we have to have prostitutes for those men. And, well, what if he's poor? Well, then the state has to pay for them. I mean, these arguments are seriously being made in some corners of academia. And it's easy to brush them off because it's corners of academia. But we have seen what happens when you take casually absolutely crazy ideas.
Women should just be required to make themselves available at a moment's notice to everyone who you know,
this is the end of that.
The least bit of interest.
Yeah, it's the end. I think a partial answer to what you're asking might be to think along the lines of Adam Smith, who saw two different spheres. And in The Wealth of Nations, he talked about the invisible hand, which governs the market. But then he also talked about theory of moral sentiments, which was the realms where the market didn't go. And at the time, that was larger than now, because it included the formation of families. And now with dating apps, you can apply economic arguments to how people make decisions on dating apps. Like, it's a lot more marketized than it was. But there is a realm where the market does not go. And traditionally, we have thought that everything that happens behind your front door is that.
Right.
You know,
right.
you don't do care.
Bedroom.
Yeah, but also with care. Like, the reason that a child cares for their aging parents isn't because the parents cared for them when they were small. It's not a market exchange. But of course, the market is coming in there. It's coming into childcare. It's coming into elderly care. And as soon as you do that, the government has opinions about how it's done. Like, if the government is providing any of the care, well, the taxpayer has opinions on whether you're a good enough carer or not. So I think we're in a state of flux where we're marketizing a bunch of things that used to live in the theory of moral sentiments realm. And that is part of what we are seeing happening. And I think it's part of the answer to your question. You know, if something is freedom of association, it's in the non-marketized part. But if what you're talking about is, say, how an entirely government-funded operation like the BBC hires, I think that's in the public domain. And that might be somewhere that you would have rules that say, this isn't about freedom of association. This is about transparency, that you are, you know, doing things in a fair and open way. You're advertising all your jobs, you know, that sort of thing. But inside your house, and certainly inside the bedroom, and when it comes to care, those aren't the rules that we play by.
The market exchange, direct market exchange argument's an interesting one. So if there's direct exchange of money for service, let's say, or goods, then the standard non-prejudicial rules should apply, and otherwise it's in the private domain, and you can go to hell in a handbasket in whatever manner you choose.
But the example that you give of, you know, rich men, having a club that's only for rich men, when we all know that is where the next candidates are going to be chosen for election, and it is where quiet words will be had about who's to be the next Governor General of the BBC or whatever. Like, that's the genuinely difficult, the edge case. Is that theory of moral sentiments, or is that wealth of nations? And I don't have a strong. I don't have a guiding principle to say where exactly that border lies, just to say that those are difficult questions. But the question of whether you want to undress in front of somebody is not difficult in the same way.